Grab your hiking boots and join us on a journey through the world of long-distance trails. In this episode of Geographical Thinking, we'll be exploring with Galen Keily from the Pacific Crest Trail Association. Together, we'll uncover the role of GIS in preserving and managing one of America's most iconic trails. Welcome back to Geographical Thinking. I'm Michelle Brake, and I'll be your guide as we explore ideas, stories, and conversations through the lens of geography. Joining me today is Galen Keily, who is the GIS specialist for the Pacific Crest Trail Association. In his role, he serves as the primary resource for Pacific Crest Trail-related spatial data, analysis, cartography, and geographic thinking. Outside of work, he is constantly learning and seeking to understand the connectivity of things happening in the world around us. And what better way to do that than exploring the world? Thank you for joining me today, Galen, and welcome to Geographical Thinking.
Hi, Michelle. Great to be with you this morning.
And where are you joining from today? Because I know on my coast, we're already in the afternoon out here in Nova Scotia, but where are we joining from today?
That is a great point. I am on the other coast, West Coast, San Luis Obispo, California.
Ooh, okay. Very jealous. Southern California and Mid-California and Upper California all have great variation in environment and weather, and the food, though, is really what pulls me back in every time. I can't get the same type of Mexican food up here in my coast on Canada as I can down there.
Yeah, totally. Pretty great food, pretty great weather a lot of the time. Not too much to complain about.
Have you had a chance to get out much this season for hiking and camping?
I actually did just get back from a trip to the Olympic Peninsula up in Washington. And yeah, experienced both the rain of Western Washington as well as some beautiful, sunny, clear days. So got to explore, do some backpacking and hiking, and yeah, had a great time.
Amazing. Glad to hear that the season's off to a good start at least. But to get us started on our topic at hand, I'm wondering if you can give us a little bit of background information on what the Pacific Crest Trail is and what the association does for it.
Absolutely. So the Pacific Crest Trail, which is often abbreviated as the PCT, is a 2,650-mile-long trail that traverses the crest of the mountain ranges along the Pacific coast of the United States. So the trail goes from Mexico to Canada through the states of California, Oregon, and Washington. And along its way, it crosses an incredible diversity of landscapes from desert to alpine, volcanic crags to heavy forest. It's largely located within places that are free from human development. So it is, a transect going through some of the most cherished and remote landscapes of the American West, like, the heart of the Sierra Nevada mountains, goes around the mighty Cascades, through old growth forests and desert. It's pretty cool. And the PCT is most famous as a through hike, so like a long distance contiguous type of journey that people do in a single season.
I think that really paints a nice picture of what are the things I might experience along the way and gets my mind thinking of, okay, we got volcanoes, we got alpine, we got forests, we have mountains. Sounds pretty great. But what else comes along the way? I know there's some different trails along there as well.
Yeah, I could talk all day about like the amazing things that you pass by. It goes, as I kind of alluded to, it goes through a lot of different jurisdictions, a lot of different national parks and national forests and other special areas. So we go through 3 states, 45 different counties, 20 congressional districts, 6 national parks. I think I can name them. North Cascades National Park, Mount Rainier, Crater Lake, Lassen Volcanic, Yosemite, and Sequoia Kings Canyon. That's 6, right?
That is 6. Great job. I've been to half of them. Can confirm they're pretty great.
Nice. Love it. And so also the PCT has a special designation as a National Scenic Trail. And this is a sort of special status that it gets from the National Trail System Act of 1968. So it gets special management and special protection based on that. And that act also calls for collaborative management of the trails, to have government agencies working alongside nonprofits and volunteers to manage that long trail consistently across those many jurisdictions that the PCT goes through. And so, PCTA is that nonprofit organization that works alongside government agencies and carries out trail maintenance, planning, and management. And we have, thousands of volunteers that help us maintain the trail, and also some professional crews. We do a lot of advocacy and planning and interfacing with different players like trail users, local communities, and land managers, government officials, and politicians, and everything from legislation to forest planning efforts, like bus routes and transportation, search and rescue, like a wide range of different things. PCTA is also well known for administering the long distance permit that people get when they do their long distance hike, that lets them bypass the local permits they would otherwise need to get. And while I'm speaking about PCTA, our mission is to advocate for the Pacific Crest Trail as an inspirational outdoor experience, to create belonging and access, and to care for and conserve the trail and the lands through which it passes.
That sounds like a pretty big task for one organization. I'm wondering, how does that play out? Do you have a strategic plan? Are there initiatives, areas of focus? Because when I think hiking, I'm like, okay, I might have a plan when I go out. There's some guidance, but as an organization, I'm sure there's a little bit more that goes into it.
Totally. Yeah. And it's always hard to describe the kind of the wide range of things that we do, because it's a lot. We do have a recently concluded strategic planning effort that we went through. We talked with our community and our, stakeholders, and kind of came up with areas of focus and initiatives for the next 3 years worth of work. And honestly, probably far beyond that into the future. A lot of it is focused on addressing climate change, centering marginalized communities, and forming lasting and meaningful partnerships, among a bunch of other stuff, to kind of add to our normal, dare I say, normal tasks of maintaining the PCT, running volunteer programs, doing land conservation and acquisition work, communicating stuff to the public, and doing our permits and providing information, all the things.
That's a lot to manage. What role do you play within this? I know I mentioned it earlier on, but in your own words, how does your job fit into all of this?
Well, yeah, so I'm the GIS person. I get to bring geographic perspectives to all this work. And I'm kind of like the de facto data person about the PCT, with using GIS to figure out how many miles of trail and acres of land is where, and all the, kind of the compendium of things out along the trail. And I try to bring the location element into our work to better understand the trail and its corridor ultimately.
So, maps, compass, GPS, these are all things that I typically think about when I'm going outdoors. But I know that I also have started using my cell phone more and more. I'm wondering, how does this combination of technologies and wayfinding tools come into people navigating the PCT, and how does that go into your work?
Definitely. More and more people are interacting with maps exclusively in the realm of the tiny supercomputers that we all carry around in our pockets, our smartphones. And the use of paper maps, pamphlets, and guidebooks is taking a bit of a back seat to maps in a digital form, whether navigating to trailheads on Google Maps, looking for trail recommendations on apps that do that, or also navigating in the backcountry on GPS enabled phone apps. And I think there's a lot of good that comes from this. Like it makes important information available to people, to a wider audience, and that's definitely a good thing. I think a lot of the time we hear a lot of negativity around it, and I understand it because I personally don't want to like be on my phone when I'm out in the backcountry. That's not why I'm there, but it can be really helpful and it can be an important safety tool. But speaking of, I would also say like bring the 10 essentials, like have a map and compass and know how to use them, because your phone can die, can fall into some water and break, things like that.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point because I enjoy going to more remote areas where cell service is pretty much non-existent. It's that forced disconnect, but with the bridging the gap of the digital divide and getting more connectivity everywhere, that comes with, well, one of the lakes I used to go to in a national park never had cell service for the longest time. Well, now it does. And all of a sudden, like my phone continues to ping. So do I turn it off? Do I leave it on? Well, I want to leave it on just in case, but then you're aware of it. It's a cycle, really. Now, going away from kind of the technology that we use every day, and everyone else may be using every day, I'm wondering about the GIS side of things and how does the organization use GIS to carry out its mission and specifically the work you're doing every day?
Definitely. And maybe before I answer how, I'll throw in a thing about why. So adding in, and I kind of alluded to it before, but adding location into our work allows us to better understand the trail, learning about what's out there, layering data that represents complex phenomena, allow us to recognize patterns and relationships we wouldn't have been able to pick out with the naked eye. So we're better able to make management decisions with the info. We're better able to communicate about complex things with maps, make things more meaningful. So adding the where into the conversation, we also are able to then provide important information to trail users. And in that vein, I have a fun fact for you.
Ooh, okay. I'm all about fun facts.
Okay. So total elevation gain on the PCT is 489,000 feet, which is
Wow.
equivalent to 17 Mount Everests.
That's a
So
lot of
that's
Mount Everest, but it sounds like I also wouldn't have to deal with the same type of permitting, the snowfall, or even the base camp experience. I feel like I'll take your 17 Mount Everest. It sounds like a great trade-off.
totally. And when I say Mount Everest, I'm talking Mount Everest from sea level. So, like, I don't think anyone
Mm,
actually does that. It's more of like you get to the base camp and then summit Mount Everest, which I think is an elevation gain of like 11,000 feet when you do the climb. So, I haven't done the math for that, but that would be more than 17 Mount Everest,
yeah.
probably more than double 17.
Okay, good call there.
Fun stuff. But anyway, back to what we do with GIS. I have some more kind of specifics for our various departments.
Yeah.
So, for our trail maintenance and mapping stuff, for one thing, we track where the trail is, and what kind of mileage is out there between features. So we calculate mile markers and maintain this all for use by hikers as well as volunteers and land managers. We also use GIS based tools for field data collection. Um, Mostly right now, we're doing stuff with like scouting the current conditions of the trail and taking
Mm,
photos and comments and rolling it all up into the cloud so we can figure out where we want to put resources.
gotcha.
Um, and yeah, I do a lot of cartography things for internal use, like passing that scouting type of data along to our agency partners, letting people know what the conditions are, but also maps for our magazine and calendar, kind of public facing things.
Yeah, we do love a map calendar here at Esri Canada. We've published one for several years now annually. So hearing that there's some stuff in works for calendars, magazines, I still love a print copy of things every so often.
Me too. Yeah, and I've put more and more effort into my cartography work. Like I think it's easy to take for granted as a GIS professional when you're doing a lot of data management, computer programming, things like that. But like there's an art to cartography, and I've been trying to harness that energy to make beautiful maps for our publications.
Yeah, and I also know there's been such a shift towards web mapping. I'm wondering, how has that shift been for you? Do you see more going away from those paper maps that we're used to having in outdoor environments towards that online space?
A lot of this kind of work happens on someone's desktop computer, and you have to be uh, pretty familiar with those complicated tools to be able to do GIS on your desktop. But more and more people are able to use online web interactive maps, and like so my work often involves more me making interactive maps for other departments to use to answer their own questions and kind of bring GIS to a more accessible place for my coworkers so they don't have to like huddle around a screen of ArcMap to figure out the answer to their questions. Um,
Gotcha. Okay. And how does this then connect with things like land conservation efforts? Because I'm sure that's, as we mentioned, a part of the mission. Where does GIS fall within that?
yeah, it's one of our bigger use cases for GIS. Like we have a database of all the private lands that the PCT passes through, which is something like 10% of the PCT, less in miles, and something like 10% when you look at acreage of our corridor. So we use GIS to track all that stuff, including ownership and land use, development, as well as like ecological values and climate related metrics associated with those lands. Um, and we use GIS to analyze and understand the role of the PCT in climate change adaptation
Hmm.
and conservation on a larger scale and beyond kind of just recreation, which is what we're more well known for. And there's a lot of science going into the connection between larger natural areas as important to wildlife and plants' adaptation to a changing climate. And the PCT can provide this with its sort of corridor of protected lands going between these islands of highly protected places like wilderness areas and things. So the PCT is like a great opportunity for that because it does that and it does it on a really landscape scale across the entirety of the Pacific Crest.
Yeah, which is awesome to see because typically, if we're thinking a trail or a national park, it's so regionalized, even despite being maybe larger in area, where you have something like the PCT that's crossing across part of a large part of the continent. I can see how that information and that experience may look a little more macro rather than micro at some of these perspectives. Um, I'm wondering, how does this go further into things like public engagement or advocacy? Because I'm sure that also layers on in our lasagna of PCTA activities.
Yeah. And when I mentioned interactive maps, I should have mentioned like PCTA's interactive map we have on our website. It's
Mm,
one of our biggest like GIS public engagement pieces. It's an interactive web map that allows people to, you know, dig into many layers, probably like 50 or so layers related to the conditions, weather, fire, where other trails are in relation to the PCT, recreation opportunities, um, current conditions, snowpack, imagery. It's a great tool for people to use to be able to kind of just like scout out potential trips or follow along with others that are out there. It's a great place to start if you're looking into the PCT, in my opinion. And we get a lot of web traffic there. Um, So yeah, the I guess the other thing I'd say about public engagement when it comes to advocacy, like when we start building in location information into all of our accomplishments, we can start talking about like where we've been doing work and what communities have maybe been benefiting from the work that we do. Like when we have people come back from projects, we have some map integrations built in so they can tell us what portions of the PCT they worked on and what they did there. So we can aggregate things based on where it happened. So, like across a certain congressional district, say, like we can say we had thousands of volunteer hours going into this with a associated dollar value of that volunteer time that went into it, so that it really tells the story of like our impact in a cool way that wouldn't have been possible if we hadn't put those pins on a map.
Yeah, it's awesome to hear how interdisciplinary the use of GIS is across the organization. I'm sure some of that comes with the understanding of how important where things are and navigating between things is in the outdoor world. So we're kind of familiar with those concepts already. It's just really nice to see how deeply integrated it goes across all of these areas.
Definitely. And it's always, I feel like my work is always kind of innovating and trying to build it in more and more and like share my geographic perspectives and consider new ways that we could be doing more with it. So it's like a great kind of way to continue innovating and adding in more and more GIS into our work because
Hmm.
I think it really pays off.
Yeah. I mean, it touches so many lives, both for those that are through hiking and I think those doing smaller sections. I think people are starting to realize just how important the GIS is, even in their day to day lives.
Totally. I mean, I think GIS is one of those things that isn't well known as like an acronym, at
Hmm.
least, but it's really what is behind technology that we use every day. Like people navigate daily with Google Maps and Apple Maps, and it's easy to take it for granted, but there's a lot of work that goes into those things and building that database of all of the roads and businesses and making it all connect. Like there's a lot of that, and so I try to do something like that and build up that model of the PCT as best I can.
Yeah. And so I know we've talked a lot about um, where the trail is, but I've heard maybe through some rumors that the trail changes length over time and might change where it's at. I'm wondering if you can explain a little bit more about this.
Yeah, definitely. There, and it actually is one of those things where it's fairly effortful to track on all of it because, believe it or not, the trail moves, and that is sometimes due to small realignments. Trails even can kind of move by themselves when people are walking on them long enough. Like
Mm,
if people start walking around a down tree or something, like in a few years, that path is going to be the one that's more defined than the old path. And it kind of just has a life of its own in that way. Um, but more significant would be like when PCTA decides to put in some new switchbacks or something, and we work with our agency partners to figure out the best way to do that. Um, and also, like, we have a process called optimal location reviews where we do a sort of complete review of the location of the PCT related to its objectives for, scenic quality and sort of primitive recreation type of things, and like see whether it's in a place that speaks to that or if there's a better location or a better route we could use. And GIS is part of that planning process too.
Now I'm wondering, with this being such a large trail, are there any challenges that you find with documenting the miles? Again, we're such a large space, and I know we can always have like little inaccuracies that pop up. I'm wondering, how does that look in your space?
For sure. The challenges with mile markers are kind of interesting. Um, for one thing, like you kind of mentioned, even minor inaccuracies that are repeated across such a large geographic extent, or say like hundreds of thousands of times, compound those errors, resulting in kind of a significant discrepancy in overall mileage. So if each point in our PCT data set, for example, were off by 1 foot, the margin of error would be over 200 miles.
Whoa, that's several days worth of extra hiking. Okay, I can understand why that would be a big deal.
Right. And so, and there's other things like projections and the way that you calculate these things in GIS versus on the ground. Like if you calculate stuff in a projection that isn't suited for maintaining distance, you will come up with something that might be off by a couple hundred miles like that when you're calculating a giant geographic feature.
Hmm, good
So,
call. So no web Mercator for us, is what I'm hearing.
yeah, that will not be a good time. I definitely have done it, and it was like putting me over 3,000 miles, I think.
Oh man,
I'm
that's
pretty sure the PCT is not that long.
well, hey, that's a great example for why we got to consider our projections carefully.
Definitely. And one other thing I'd add is like whenever the trail shifts in one spot and we have a small reroute, say everything north of there then gets added or subtracted. So those mile markers will, everything north of there will be, a mile longer, say. And it can be challenging because other organizations or other mapping applications will display their own mileage, and maybe it's not the same as what we have. And like between different apps and different guidebooks, you might see different mile markers, and there's even signed mileages on the trail. And having those all speak the same language is something we are hoping to do. And by approaching that, we're like trying to kind of center PCTA as like the data provider, and we provide that PCT centerline data where the trail is and the mile markers, with like an open license for anyone to use, including app developers. And we also pass this stuff to our government partners to make sure that if there is a reroute happening and they need to have it in their databases, we can get it to them.
Yeah, and I'm wondering when we're considering reroutes and future access, are there any concerns about development surrounding the trail and any impact it may have on future access to land?
Definitely. PCTA works to protect that kind of wilderness and primitive recreational experience of the PCT as it's legislated to be treated. So we want to enable the natural appearance and sense of remoteness for the trail users. And that's especially true on private lands where the PCT is only protected by narrow easements covering really like the trail tread, and nothing really outside of it. So that means like development could happen just feet away from the trail tread, and that could be something like building a skyscraper right next to the trail, and that would obviously affect those sort of recreational values that the PCT has and scenic values. And that's especially true on those private lands. And I mentioned the PCT remains roughly 10% on private lands. And my most recent calculation puts it at something like 150 miles of the PCT,
Wow.
which is less than 10%, which is cool, but it's still significant. And we're working to kind of fill those gaps through our land acquisition program, where we acquire lands and ultimately sell them to agencies that can protect them in perpetuity.
Awesome. And I'm wondering on the recreation side, um, there's always like view sheds, and we're wondering about like ecological uses. Any thoughts on how that conservation looks in your space?
Yeah, and so I touched on the recreational side of it, but there's ecological values too. And I mentioned before, but there's science about how connecting conserved areas is important for climate adaptation. And the PCT's corridor of protection is a great way to kind of foster this. So by filling those gaps of private lands, we're able to create a more consistent corridor that can be used by plants and animals as they slowly or quickly adapt to changing conditions.
Gotcha. And as someone who follows along as hikers start sharing their trips each year, the trail seems to be growing steadily in popularity. I can imagine that this could lead to some crowded spots in the future. I'm wondering, how does management of visitors' use work with the trail? Is there a limit to how many people can be on there at a time? Is it a free for all?
Yeah, definitely. Hiking and outdoor recreation is increasing, like you said, in general. And the PCT is no different. And that's, I think, good in a lot of ways, like more people being able to get out and enjoy trails, support rural economies, like lots of hikers coming off of trail to buy things in stores out in pretty remote places, which is great. But this can also have an impact on the resources out there. Like more people out means more people camping, more waste being generated, and more effect on those local ecosystems that are often fragile. And so, yeah, we want to protect those ecosystems and the trail experience that could be affected by those things. And so we do work in visitor use management, which is like a field in its own right. Some people dedicate their careers to. And so PCTA works alongside academic researchers and government experts to study these impacts and use levels, but we're not the ones that are like deciding how many people can be on the trail at certain times, though local regulations do exist in certain places.
Gotcha. Okay. And is there anyone out there collecting data on these permits?
There are, yes. Like we have things like trailhead registers where people can, sign a little book with their trail names and say when they're starting, and that allows us to glean some information. There's also trail counters that count people as they pass without anyone really even knowing and not, intruding on anything. But also we have staff that go out and collect data on hikers by talking to them and collecting information about the permits that they have. And while they do that, like informing about responsible trail use, like leave no trace principles and stuff. And it's a cool example of like, it's not just the sheer number of people that matters, it's also the way those people interact with the land. If they follow leave no trace, a few people that aren't doing that might have a bigger impact than a lot of people who are following leave no trace principles.
Okay. And acknowledging it's a unique and fragile ecosystem, I'm wondering, with the trail covering such a large area and thousands of people interacting with the trail in a year, how does the PCTA's work intersect with topics like climate change, conservation, and sustainability?
Well, yeah, it's hard to think about summer in the American West without thinking about wildfire and smoke and drought and bark beetles and things like that, which are definitely impacts of a changing climate. Um, but we also think a lot about the effect of extreme wet weather on these fire damaged or otherwise unprepared landscapes. And PCTA has really only recently started communicating more intentionally about climate change. But we certainly recognize that the climate is changing and that it affects land and people. So we're looking at climate change in lots of aspects of our work. It's kind of a lens through which we do all the other stuff I've been talking about. Um, and if you'd like, I could share some examples of some of the things we see that affect the PCT.
Yeah, that would be great. Because again, I feel like everyone sees it in the news of like, okay, there's a fire, there's a drought, there's maybe a freak bout of hail or a snowstorm that comes in. So I'm wondering, what are the things that you're seeing?
Yeah, so of course, when there's wildfires, that's a safety concern. There's a lot of times closures related to these fires. And we, for just kind of aside, we're working on providing that info in some cool new ways. So stay tuned for that. What's open and what's closed.
Gotcha. Okay.
Um, but also, you know, associated with wildfires, like often they make it so that we have to do different kinds of maintenance on these affected landscapes. Like what would have been a routine maintenance job now is a much more intensive reconstruction, which costs more money, takes more hours. Um, there might be lots of trees falling down in the years following, and certainly the immediate following of a wildfire. More brushing that might be needed if it used to be a forest and now it's like a meadow where there's fire adapted brushes kind of growing up across the trail. Like
Yeah.
that'll be harder than it was. um, and there's lots of stuff with drought and tree die off based on the drought conditions, and they become more vulnerable to insects and stress and wildfire for that matter. It's like this all feeds into each other.
Hmm. I'm wondering, knowing that this does all play a large part together, is that some of what's gone into the strategic plan that you mentioned earlier, or is this something that you're still developing plans for?
Yeah, I mean, so we have a fairly good baseline through all the science out there on climate change generally. And we, having seen a lot of change ourselves, I think have a good ability to speak to like how it's affecting the PCT specifically. And what we're doing now is kind of, and it is associated with our strategic plan, is to define what our actions can be that will help us adapt and be more resilient as a long distance trail with respect to climate.
Yeah. And that's, I think, really important work as people recreate and get out there. They naturally also have a desire to help protect those spaces and feel a sense of stewardship. So I'm wondering if people are looking to get involved with the association or get out there on the trail, how can they get started? Where do they find this information?
Well, yeah, so people can volunteer with us for one thing if you're in the kind of general area of the PCT. We do many volunteer projects each year that are really cool. You can learn a lot. A lot of them you don't need to have past experience. There's trainings and things that you can do online as well. You can also donate to us so that we can better fund projects like the ones I've been talking about. You can also just choose to sign up for our newsletter on our website and kind of just stay in the loop with us. We love to have people connected. You can follow us on social media. We post fun map quizzes most Mondays or Tuesdays. We call them Map Mondays or Topo Tuesdays, but you can take our quizzes and see what we come up with to trick you about the geography of the PCT.
Okay.
Um,
Count me in. I'll be there.
yeah, definitely check it out. You would like it, Michelle. Um, but yeah, and like if you haven't before, like get out and check out the trail. Go hiking. It's pretty amazing, and you won't regret it.
Yeah. Okay. I'll add it on for next year's plans for vacation. Maybe if I make it down to any of the conferences that we offer through Esri that are in your area, we'll make sure to
Yes,
add on some hiking to the list.
totally.
And now, one thing I want to leave us on a little bit of a fun note, there seems to be a lot of lingo that's specific to the trail and the through hiking community. Can you give us some insights into some of the terms that people may come across as they dive deeper into the community? I'll give you a term, and can you give me the definition?
Yes,
Okay.
let's do it.
So we talked through hiker, section hiker. What's the difference?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say there's like a cut and dry definition, but section hikers might be just doing a smaller section of a long distance hike. It can still be a long distance hike, but maybe not the whole PCT, maybe just like the Washington section, for example.
Gotcha. Okay. And Nobo and Sobo?
Yes, you hear these a lot out on trail. Nobo is northbound and Sobo southbound.
Gotcha. Okay. Self-explanatory. Now, flip-flopping, yo-yoing. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to bring extra footwear. What's the deal here?
Right. Flip flops and bring your flip flops, bring your yo yos. A flip flop or flipping is when you start somewhere kind of in the middle of a long distance hike and go one direction and get transportation back to where you started and then go the other direction.
Gotcha.
And then the yo yo idea is you hike an entire long distance hike and then you turn around and do it the other way back to where
Whoa.
you started. So
If
that's
one,
like a double long distance hike.
yeah, if one time wasn't enough, you get to do it again.
Yes.
I always hear about trail names. How do these come about? Is it a nickname that I give myself?
Usually not. I mean, I would say if you really wanted something, you could probably choose it for yourself, but normally it's given to you and you accept it as your identity for the course of your trip. And it can change. You can choose a different one. There's no real rules, I would say.
Gotcha. Okay. And 0 days and Nero days?
Yeah. So 0 days are days that you don't hike when you're doing a long distance hike or a through hike. So, like if you're in town for the day, resting up, that's a 0 day.
Okay.
But
And go ahead.
the Nero day is a day that you mostly don't hike, but you maybe hike a little bit, which is kind of
Mm,
funny, right? But like if you spent the day in town, but you want to get back out on trail, you might hike a few miles out to your next campsite to just get started. And that would be a Nero day.
okay. Second to last one here. LNT. This one I think I might have an idea because I think you mentioned it before. Leave no trace?
Yes, that's it. You got it. And
Okay.
there's 7 principles to leave no trace that I don't have in front of me, but you should look them up and they're probably written on your outdoor gear. It's like well established stuff and important to know when you're out there.
Okay. And our last one, trail magic. Am I practicing with bringing a rabbit out of a hat? Tell me what this is. I need to know.
Well, yeah, there's kind of a conceptual trail magic that's like, and people often say the trail provides cool things that happen when you're out on a through hike, like running into someone you haven't seen in a long time, getting offered a job or something, like getting, I don't know, nice people giving you free stuff or something. Like through hikers get that kind of special treatment sometimes. And people like to, be a part of it. So I would say that counts as trail magic, but also counting as trail magic is like planned acts of kindness for hikers by people that want to do nice things specifically for hikers. So that could be sitting at a trailhead and giving out cold beverages or food, cooking for people, giving people rides back from trailheads, maybe even giving people a place to stay, that kind of thing.
Okay. That does sound like a pretty magical experience now that you outline it.
Definitely.
Yeah. Thank you for shedding some light on some of that lingo so that we don't find ourselves lost in conversation because I don't think I have a map for that one, but now I do. And thank you for providing insight into the crucial work being done on the PCT by the PCTA and all of the work you do. I didn't realize how much went in to managing such a long trail. Probably should have thought that bigger trail, more stuff, but regardless, thank you for sharing your insight.
Absolutely. Bigger trail, more stuff is a fun way to talk about it. But yeah, I appreciate it. It's been fun sharing with you.
Awesome. And I'll make sure if when I go out on the trail in the future to give you some heads up and say, okay, during the section, what do I need to know? What's the best spot to stay?
I can definitely give you some good recommendations.
Amazing. And on that, we wrap up our journey along the Pacific Crest Trail. A big thank you again to Galen Keily from the Pacific Crest Trail Association for sharing insights into the vital role GIS plays in preserving and managing this iconic trail. If you're looking for more information about the technical side of GIS, check out the Spatial Report podcast where Mark and Maggie dive into the latest and greatest in the world of GIS. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep thinking geographically.